Coming together, police begin to suspect that this is not an isolated incident.
We'd learned that these two incidences were very, very similar, were almost both jealous, enraged incidents where he attacked another female up in Michigan.
This is the story of Kay Baker and how jealousy spiraled into tragedy and a brutal murder. It's a calm night around this Kittredge Drive, which is typically a quiet neighborhood.
It's considered one of the nicer parts of the county. It's got the neighborhood there, but the next major road isn't any kind of road. There's people just walking up and down. Really only going down there if you live down there or if you have business down there. In the middle of the night, at 12:30 at night, there's not a lot of businesses open down there. Primarily just residential, working class neighborhood that, you know, people aren't just roaming the streets and looking to attack anybody.
It is just after midnight on the evening of the 22nd of May 2022 that local residents from the Lithia community report hearing a disturbance.
And they heard what they described as a thump outside. This thump was followed by what they described as what sounded like somebody gasping or crying. They exited their house and they saw a person lying in the yard, and they believed, based on kind of the person's small stature, that it was a teenager who had maybe passed out drunk or something. When they got closer, they could see that this person was bleeding pretty severely, and they called 911. They were just kind of standing in their yard looking around, and there wasn't anything obvious about what had happened to this person.
I need emergency, please.
What emergency?
Ambulance.
Stay on the line.
I think it's right in front of my house. My husband just went out there. They have
tell me exactly what happened.
Lacerate cuts.
Okay, who's cut?
Someone next door. Who is this? It's a teenager.
Okay, male or female?
I think it's a girl. She's just they have a major cut to their neck.
They were definitely shocked because, like I said, this is a very quiet, very safe neighborhood where things like this just don't happen. And to hear that and then walk out of your door at 12 o'clock at night it's a lot to deal with if you're not expecting that.
EMS is right here. Hey, and all you guys who are out here, and stay out here for a minute, okay?
The deputies get there, they kind of determine what's going on, they try to render aid, they kind of start neighborhood surveys to kind of figure out exactly what's going on. The area is taped off with the crime scene. There's a lot of patrol units there, there's a lot of supervisors, and then our homicide section starts to get there. For the most part, it's contained, it's safe, because by the time we get out there, it's normally about an hour or so after the incident had occurred.
When I got there, the victim's body was on the ground. She was covered in a white sheet. At that point, law enforcement had put up crime scene tape. They were interviewing witnesses and just trying to make sense of the scene as a whole.
You're probably going to have detectives come and talk to you again.
That's fine.
From the beginning.
Yeah. What happened?
How did you discover?
Well, I was actually asleep out here on the couch, and wife and one kid was in the bedroom.
Okay. Our older
They
daughter
were asleep.
was asleep upstairs.
She was asleep upstairs, and I heard this freaking scream, like, really bad. And I thought it was my kid. I ran to my stairway, and I said, "Sylvie, are you okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And I was like, "Are you sure?" She was like, "Yeah." So I was like, "Well, I heard a scream." And so I came out here, and she was right there.
Detective Vertu and I did a initial walkthrough of the incident scene so we can kind of get a grasp of what exactly we're dealing with that evening. It was a violent, very sad scene.
I go into the scene, I see the female deceased there initially, obvious trauma to her neck. It's at the hands of some kind of violence, some kind of homicidal violence. Any kind of physical evidence that might be laying on the ground, weapons. In this case, there was some blood spatter areas that were of interest to us, as well as any kind of surveillance cameras, witnesses, anybody that's kind of lingering around.
Detectives quickly identify the victim. She is 43-year-old math teacher and mum of two, Kay Baker.
Some of the neighbors provided the information to us that it looked like the female that lives at this house. We were able to confirm that through eventually some fingerprints and her driver's license photo. Where she was laying was actually 2 houses down from where she lived. So she had her house, there was another house in between, and then she was between that house and the third house. She was kind of laying in a yard. There was no fence that connected her backyard to this area, so we were unsure if she ran from her house through the backyard or towards the front, where she ended up in between these two houses.
From everything that we've learned talking to family and friends and neighbors, that she was a loving, caring, amazing woman. She was an elementary school teacher, which speaks volumes.
She taught 3rd grade math at Cypress Creek Elementary School, and she had a lot of very close friends. She had a group of friends that they called themselves the Golden Girls, because I guess they sort of saw themselves in the characters of the Golden Girls TV show. From everybody that knew her, it just, she was a very delightful person, very easy person to get along with. She was also very good with children. I think she had studied in college to become a teacher and had always wanted to work with children and really enjoyed teaching math at the school where she taught. Evidently so good at it that at one point the superintendent for the school district came to watch her teach. She also had 2 young boys of her own.
She was in a very good relationship with her ex. They were co-parenting. Both were very successful, and she just seemed like a very good-hearted person.
Police now cautiously approach Kay Baker's home, just a few short meters from where her body is discovered.
The deputies found the door open to her house, actually, and so immediately they went in the house to search for any other victims or even a possible suspect inside. Once they found that it was empty of any other person, they backed out of it. A search warrant was obtained to be able to go in and actually process it for evidence.
The initial scene was the outside scene. Eventually, a search warrant was obtained so they could go into the house, and that's where we noticed that there was a knife missing from the butcher block, which was like a beak-shaped little paring knife that was missing. There was some damage to some doors that looked like people had been trying to hide in. And then, of course, we had the window that was removed on the kid's bedroom.
The window on the south side of her house, the screen was pushed out and the window was opened. Appeared as if somebody maybe crawled out of that window. Initially, the way it looked is that maybe she had climbed out there and ran to the spot where she ended up dying.
It looked like somebody had barricaded themselves in the bedroom to try to get away from somebody, and then ultimately decided that they needed to get out of the house to try to get away.
Detectives continue to interview Kay's neighbors and start to piece together her last known movements.
We learned that it was the last day of school, and then one of the neighbors kind of pulled up her Facebook page and showed us that she had a boyfriend that was there.
Talking to the neighbors and then even some of her friends, we learned a recent live-in boyfriend. They had known each other for a long time, but had recently just started living together and dating, I think, a few months since he had gotten down from Michigan.
And that's when we learned that his vehicle was in the driveway, and at that time he had been unaccounted for.
As the investigation continues to unfold, the focus now shifts to locating a crucial element to solving this case: Matthew Terry, Kay's boyfriend. Lithia, Florida, May 2022. 43-year-old elementary school teacher Kay Baker is found murdered outside her neighbor's house. Kay's boyfriend, 47-year-old Matthew Terry, is unaccounted for. And as police search the crime scene, they discover a blood trail leading away from Kay's body.
I remember walking down from the incident location, Kay Baker's house, walking the backyard of where they have kind of started to see the blood trail, and then walking in between the houses when we ultimately find where Kay Baker is deceased. So Detective Ritu and I drove around to the backside where there was a deputy that was kind of holding the initial crime scene. And then we just got out with some flashlights and we're like, if it led into here, let's see what we can find. And then I found a small blood drop on the other side of the thick brush from the house, and then Detective Ritu started looking as well, and he could see that those blood drops were coming from the back of the house in that thick brush. Canine Champ comes, who is a bloodhound, and they're trained on using scent to kind of pick up a track and run with it.
The bloodhound tracks for about the distance of a football field along the edge of the roadway, following the trail of blood until eventually law enforcement comes to a very large, almost sort of dinner-sized plate pool of blood. Realizing that something there has changed, they call in aviation, who have special cameras that can see in the dark, can see infrared. They end up seeing what looks like maybe a body laying on the ground in the bushes.
Right here? Yeah, right here is where the sheriff started going in. And I found blood on the other side of the oak trees there.
Off. Sheriff's Office K-9, if you're in the woods, make yourself known. Dog's gonna bite you.
The K9 unit picks up a scent and prompts investigators to action.
Yeah.
Hey. Sheriff's Office, show me your hands! Hey! Show me your hands! Keep your hands where we can see them! You get bit by the dog! Keep your hands up! Keep your hands where we can see them! I got him.
Follow that light.
Hey girl, what's your name? What's that?
It was in that area that they eventually found Matthew Terry. He was only wearing a shirt and some underwear, and he had some wounds to his neck where he was bleeding.
He was covered in blood and in his underwear, and he was in pretty bad shape at that point.
He was somebody of interest to us to begin with, and then we go to find him. He's covered in his own blood as well as her blood. He's got some cuts on his hands and that kind of thing. It's indicative of being in some kind of struggle or a fight with a sharp object or a knife. Initially, at that point, he's obviously somebody we wanted to find to begin with, and now we see the state he's in, so our red flag's up a little bit. He's found about 5 in the morning, about 5 hours after the original 911 call.
He was lying there for hours upon end. There was lights, there was sirens, there was deputies involved. There was an opportunity for him, if he was attacked, for him to come forward.
Well, it was obviously very suspicious, but the fact that Mr. Terry had 2 injuries to his neck immediately raises concerns that something might have happened. There's the possibility that either he was attacked too, though the fact that he'd been laying in the bushes for hours and never called for help, even though law enforcement was maybe just 100 feet away from him, was suspicious. The other possibility, of course, is that he's self-injured and trying to start an initial claim of some sort of self-defense.
He does end up having to go to the hospital, so we meet him there to try to speak with him about kind of his side of the story, expecting to hear some great explanation for everything, and ultimately he didn't want to talk to us, even with a lawyer. He said he had some scrapes to his arms, some cuts to his hands, as well as some puncture marks to his neck that were a little weird looking just on the surface. If you're being stabbed in the neck by somebody else, they would be a little more, not as clean as they had looked, I guess.
There were some doctors that had told us that it was possible that they were self-inflicted.
As police continue to interrogate Terry, detectives also need to speak to Kay Baker's family.
We had become aware that she had 2 young boys, but we quickly learned that she had shared the time with those boys with her ex-husband.
Kay had separated from her husband. They had 2 boys who were young elementary school age children. They had moved into separate homes and started separate lives after their separation. They had shared custody. That's why on this particular night, Kay didn't have her boys with her. But all accounts suggested that Kay and her ex got along very well, had a loving relationship, and were being great parents to their children.
And luckily, we met with the ex-husband right away and found that he had the boys that night.
We actually knocked on the door. It was early morning. It took him a little bit of time to answer the door. They were kind of asking us to identify ourselves. We told them we were the sheriff's office. And then eventually they came to the door, and we unfortunately ended up telling him the news and laying eyes on the children and making sure that they were okay. Talking with his now wife and knowing that they were dead asleep, and there was no evidence that he had been involved in this at all.
Kay's official cause of death is quickly established.
Our crime scene detective, Detective Van Gelder, was out there that evening. The medical examiner's office gets contacted, and the doctor came out to do initial findings and kind of give us some insight of how she was killed. Her findings was that she suffered a large laceration to her neck that severed some arteries, and basically she had bled out there at the scene. Once the search warrant was obtained and we were able to get into the house, there was evidence that there was some kind of, I would say, altercation. We had some doorways that were kicked into doors as if somebody was in there and trying to get in, and then we obviously had the locked door that was with the window pushed out, and then the main one was when we accounted for all the knives in the butcher's block, that bird's beak paring knife was missing. At that point, our main focus was trying to find the weapon used.
Since I was there from the get-go, I was very focused on trying to find the knife. Juries want to see the murder weapon. They ideally want to see it in the hands of the person who's accused. So a lot of effort was put into trying to find that.
So we used metal detectors, hand search. We were in the area where he was found. We searched extremely hard and well. The issue was we were dealing with a small area where he was found, yes, but the area from where we know Kay Baker was deceased, the brush that he went through, and probably about 100, 150 yards of rural highway with thick brush and a small knife, it could have been thrown anywhere.
There were Ring cameras, but a lot of them were motion activated. None of them were really activated by any kind of vehicles or any other people walking by. It seemed pretty isolated from her house to where she was killed, which wouldn't have activated any of the other cameras. So no other video surveillance was obtained from the neighborhood.
With local surveillance footage drawing a blank, detectives begin to re-examine Kay's last known movements prior to her murder.
Detective or two did an amazing job of going back and actually finding out that it was the last day of school. She was a teacher. They were at the local bar, local hangout spot, just enjoying, celebrating that last day. She was with friends, some colleagues.
She indicated that there was some issue at the bar. She maybe was aware that Matthew Terry has this kind of jealous history of whatever girl he's dating. So there was a little incident at the bar that she had brought up right away. It's not like she had to think back at something that happened. This was, I guess, something that happened at the bar that kind of consumed the night.
During the evening, Kay got up to use the restroom and went to the restroom, and on her way there, she saw her friend. As they kind of passed each other, they were having fun and started kind of dancing and playing around.
Looks like they're just having a good time. There might be some music playing. So they just kind of throw their arms up and have an innocent little dance as some other patron walks by them. He also kind of looks like he wants to join in. He's just trying to get by them, but he also throws his arms up in kind of that playful dance.
Nothing really more than that, and Mr. Terry evidently saw that and became jealous of what he had seen and started asking Kay about that when she returned to their table.
You can just tell that at that point the mood had changed from a celebration to some kind of like jealousy, where it's almost like he was accusing her of dancing with somebody at the bar, and he witnessed it with his own eyes, and he's trying to figure out what's going on.
Matthew Terry becomes kind of pushy about confronting her about this, what was going on, why were you dancing with that guy, and everyone else seems to be telling Matthew Terry that it wasn't a big deal. I don't know if it seems like he can't let it go, or if he just bottles it up and then, confronts it once they get home later.
On the way home, he and Kay are driving back to her house, and she calls her friend who had been at the bar with them and says, "Can you please tell Matt that I wasn't dancing with that guy, or I wasn't flirting with that guy," something to that effect. Her friend gets on the phone and, tells him, there was nothing there, and tries to calm him down, and they hang up, and Kay sends a text to her friend and says, "Sorry about that, it's so dumb," and just kind of dismisses it.
But it seems as if there's still that jealousy aspect of that incident that happened at that bar that continues throughout the evening. So I think friends were just, seeing what they saw at the bar, that they're making sure that they're okay, and eventually Kay tells them, yeah, everything's okay, we're fine. And that's kind of one of the last time anybody hears from Kay Baker.
Lithia, Florida, May 20th, 2022. Kay Baker, a 43-year-old elementary school teacher and mother of two, is found murdered outside her neighbor's house, where she has been stabbed a number of times. Within hours, police apprehend Kay's boyfriend, Matthew Terry, who is found hiding in nearby bushes. Delving into Terry's history, investigators uncover a chilling revelation: a prior assault on a woman back in 2017.
We actually learned that he did some prison time. From what we were able to gather, once Detective or two was able to reach out to the Michigan detective, we learned that these two incidences were very, very similar, were almost both jealous, enraged incidents where he attacked another female up in Michigan.
So the other attack is frighteningly similar. Once again, it's sort of a celebratory night. In the case of Michigan, it's St. Patrick's Day. Matt Terry and his then girlfriend Michelle go out to a local bar. They're celebrating. Matt Terry is again drinking fairly heavily.
Matthew Terry ended up attacking her and grabbed a knife and began to stab her, and stabbed her repeatedly, and she was able to get away and escaped through the garage door of their home. He chased her and tackled her on the front lawn and was kind of grappling with her and continuing to try to stab her.
Thankfully, there's a neighbor across the street who hears the commotion, comes outside, and breaks it all up. The defendant gets up and goes back into the home, taking the knife with him, leaving Michelle in the driveway bleeding. She's again been stabbed in the neck, as well as other parts of her upper torso, in the face and on the shoulders. When law enforcement comes, Matthew Terry is found inside the home. He is covered in blood, all on his chest and his arms. Sort of coincidentally, he's again in a shirt and a pair of underwear and no pants. He is taken into custody and ultimately claims a sort of self-defense argument, saying that Michelle had actually attacked him and he had had to fight for his life, and she had been stabbed in the process of trying to defend himself, which is why pretty early on we thought that Matthew Terry might have stabbed himself in the neck to make a self-defense claim, because he'd already done this once before.
Detective or two and I looked at each other and can say, if he's done it this before, then there's a great likelihood that he did this again.
She'd, I guess, gotten wind of what happened and reached out to me. I talked to her briefly over the phone initially, and she gave me the whole kind of story of everything, and it kind of sounded very similar to what happened, so it was very interesting to me. And she had said she tried to warn Miss Baker. From what I understand, he got a lighter sentence for that charge and only served a few years in Michigan.
He got about 3 years in the Michigan prison system and then had probation to follow. All in all, it was a fairly light sentence.
I mean, the laws are different in the state of Michigan than they are in Florida. I know in Florida, for something like that, that would be considered an unusual sentence, given the violent nature of it.
The defendant at that point didn't have any real record, and so I think a judge looked at him and took some leniency on him. I know that people went up to Michigan to testify on his behalf. As it turns out, Kay Baker actually went to Michigan, and she even testified at the trial on his behalf to say what a good guy and what an honest guy he is, and how unlikely it is that he would try to hurt anybody on purpose. I'm sure that that played a major role in ultimately the verdict and the decision for the sentence.
She truly cared for this person, she loved this person, and she thought he was a good person, which we later find out is not the truth.
Police have heard and seen enough to make a decision to charge for the murder of Kay Baker.
He was charged that same night with some anticipation that some of this evidence was going to lead to him. We can collect this stuff. We believe it's going to show results as we expect, but there was enough probable cause to charge him that night. He seemed intoxicated. He seemed kind of stoic about the whole thing. Even just getting the news, if you want to believe there's some other attacker out there, that he never brought any of that up. He's getting the news that his girlfriend has been killed, and he just doesn't react to that in any way. Once we kept building, everything kept pointing back to him.
Matthew Terry grew up in a fairly normal American family. His family came from some means. They certainly weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination. He had a fairly normal childhood. He had a father and a mother who loved him, friends and family who were there and supportive through the various stages of his life. He ultimately graduated from high school, entered the military, served in the military for a period of years, got out, and had, established himself as a fairly normal person in the world. There wasn't anything unusual about him. People tried to suggest that he might have been changed by his time in the military, but it didn't appear that he had actually ever seen any sort of actual combat service. He wasn't in any place where like people were shooting at him or anything like that, which doesn't diminish his service, but certainly suggests that he wasn't probably suffering from any sort of PTSD or anything like that.
As the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office charged Terry, they feel confident about bringing him to justice.
This one definitely sticks with me because it's just so brutal, and the fact that the defendant had just gotten out of prison for effectively doing the same thing. I ended up meeting the victim from the Michigan case and talking with her and listening to her account of what happened in Michigan and understanding how much it was basically the same story of what happened down here in Tampa. It was scary how similar it was. It also always sticks with you when you're dealing with the family and the next of kin. They've lost a loved one, and I always take it very seriously, the notion that they're counting on someone like me to ultimately get them some sense of justice. And so it's a very serious responsibility, and it's a heavy burden, but it's one that's important to take on because somebody's got to go to court and fight for justice for Kay and her family.
Terry's legal team push for a speedy trial, something very unusual for a murder case.
In this particular case, the defense chose to not waive speedy trial, and so that meant we had to go to trial in under 6 months. That's not normal in most murder cases. Typically, defense attorneys will waive speedy trial so they have lots of time to investigate all the evidence, to do all the depositions. But because they didn't waive speedy trial, we were kind of like on a rocket trying to get through everything as fast as possible.
In my experience, it was one of the quicker cases that had gone to trial that I'd been a part of. And our state attorney's office did an amazing job, with the state attorney being Justin Diaz, in preparing us, getting witness statements, getting our statements, and getting us prepared and prepped and ready to go to trial, because it did happen very quickly.
It made things move at a very, very hectic and fast pace, but it was something that could be done. Basically had to put most everything else on hold and just work on this case. But for about 6 months of my life, I did nothing but the Matthew Terry case most days, day in and day out. I think there could be a couple reasons. One, obviously, I think that they are hoping that forensic results will not come back in time. Because the blood ended up being so important in this case, we have to send that off to a lab where scientists will then analyze it and look for DNA to tell us what is in any particular area where blood is encountered. Is that Kay's blood? Is that the defendant's blood? Is that a combination of their blood? That unfortunately takes time. Science doesn't always move as fast as we want it to, and so the lab is working furiously to get those things done. But when you're talking about dozens and dozens of different swabs of suspected blood, or from people's hands, or from Kay's body, I think the defense is not waiving speedy trial in the hope that they can force the case to trial before all of the DNA comes back. Thankfully, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement did an excellent job. Typically in 6 months, we're lucky if we can get 1 round of testing, but because we were able to contact them and tell them the importance of the case, we actually knocked out 2 rounds of testing, and that made a huge difference at the end of the day for helping us identify the fact that Kay's blood was literally on the defendant's hands.
Yeah, I was really confident prosecutor on this case. I was very confident with Justin Diaz. Did a great job of prosecuting the case. He had his ducks in a row, so there was pretty high level of confidence going into it that he was going to be convicted.
In less than a month, we've already taken the case to grand jury. We've obtained an indictment, and the defendant is now officially charged with first-degree murder. He goes to his first appearance in front of a judge where it's called arraignment. He enters a plea of not guilty, and then we're going to start the process of going through what's called discovery, where I'm turning over copies of police reports and photos and videos and other things that we might have in our possession to the defense attorney so they can look at all the evidence and ultimately talk to the defendant about what the evidence is against him. After that, we move into what's called depositions, which are chances for the defense attorney to conduct interviews with the various witnesses. Because we had witnesses out of state, we ended up traveling to Michigan to talk to some of those witnesses, as well as all the law enforcement and other witnesses that are down here in Hillsborough County. That's a fairly fast process.
Matthew Terry's demeanor in court was mostly calm, polite. There were a few moments in court where he appeared to become emotional, particularly when they showed pictures of Kay Baker. There were some moments where he appeared to sob somewhat. He appeared to become a little bit emotional at certain points in the trial.
He was just a very cocky, very arrogant in the way his mannerisms were. In my eyes, he had kind of been through this process already. He didn't get that heavy of a sentence, so I think there was some confidence with him going into the trial.
We're only there for our portion. In this case, I was there for several hours. We're sequestered from other witnesses, so once we do our part, we have to leave the courtroom, and we can't really talk about anything with any of the other detectives or anybody involved. It was a rule of the courts. They don't want us sharing information. They don't want, if there's a defense theory that they're going with, they don't want us divulging that to the next witness who's going to testify and have somebody's testimony be altered.
I did testify in the trial. Detective Vertu was the main focus in the trial because he was the lead detective. I did testify to the blood that I found on the side of the thick patch of woods behind her house and searching for the knife and those kind of things.
The police did a great job in this case. I have a lot of kudos to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. I've worked with many of them before. They always do a great job, but in this case, they did a really, really good job. They knew that we were under the gun of speedy trial. They knew that there was a lot of stuff that needed to be done, and so they worked very diligent, especially in the early days, to build a very solid case. And then as we were progressing through the discovery process, once the case had been filed, they were working hand in glove with our office to assist us in anything we needed.
Detective Vertu did an amazing job of just his interviews, the collection of the video, our crime scene detective, our crime scene investigators collecting evidence at the scene, you know, our canine deputies. It was just a total team effort. We even had the helicopter up in the air that night. The sheriff's office just really embodies that teamwork and effort, and it was just an amazing all-around job.
Given Terry's similar previous crime, the District Attorney's Office feels it is paramount to include these details in this trial.
So normally in a case, when a defendant is accused of a crime, you can't talk about any other crimes they've ever committed. The jury has to make the decision based solely on the evidence from this particular investigation. However, in the state of Florida, we have what's called Williams Rule evidence, what is also known as similar fact evidence. If there is another crime that has been committed and the facts are so similar, there are limited reasons why you can admit the evidence of the other case to prove something important in the current case. A judge listens to the evidence that's going to be admitted and listens to the evidence in this case and has to basically make a determination on, are the facts and circumstances similar enough, and is there something important that that other case will help explain in the current case? A judge decided that there was a sufficient similarity between the two different crimes, the one in Michigan and the one in Tampa, and we were able to put on some evidence from the Michigan case. Specifically, we put on the victim from Michigan, and she came and told the same story about how they had been out drinking, celebrating, it had turned into an argument in the home, it had turned violent, she had tried to run away, he had chased her down, he had stabbed her repeatedly with a knife from a butcher block and had injured her in the neck.
With police and the DA's office expecting to hear a self-defense excuse, they are shocked at Terry's defense argument.
I think they shied away from a self-defense argument, but then ultimately they went to an argument I didn't even remotely expect. When we got to trial, I was ready to argue if they were going to argue self-defense, and the defense was sort of cagey about whether or not they were ever going to argue it. I think they were waiting to see what they wanted to do, and so they were keeping their cards very close to their chest. And in closing arguments, the defense got up and basically told a story where they suggested that there was a phantom killer, some third person that we didn't know, had never heard of, and there was no reason to believe existed, that this person had somehow gotten into Kay Baker's home, that he was the one responsible for attacking Kay and the defendant inside the home, that he had chased Kay Baker, and then ultimately he had been outside laying in wait for her. It was very confusing, and it didn't seem to comport with the evidence at all.
Toward the end of the trial, Matthew Terry expressed some dissatisfaction over not being allowed to essentially testify and tell his side of the story. And it was something that kind of came out when the jury was already deliberating. He told the judge that he wanted to testify, but that his lawyers had advised him not to, which is kind of standard in a lot of criminal cases. They don't want defendants to testify because it opens them up to being cross-examined by the prosecutor.
Both police and the District Attorney's Office have done all they can for this infamous murder trial. Now it is up to the jury to deliberate and decide a verdict. Will they put Matthew Terry away for life? Lithia, Florida, May 2022. 43-year-old elementary school teacher Kay Baker is found outside her neighbor's house covered in her own blood and is later pronounced dead. Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office charges her boyfriend, Matthew Terry, with her murder when he is found hours later hiding in the bushes not far from her home. After a considerably fast trial and hearing Matthew Terry's bizarre defense argument, the jury now deliberate their verdict.
I don't think the jury was swung by it at all. I mean, the story just didn't make any sense, and I remember giving my second closing argument, basically explaining how it just didn't make any sense. You were going to have to believe that some man, for no apparent reason, had killed Kay Baker, and then, as the defense suggested, while Kay Baker's being killed, Matthew Terry came outside of the home looking for his girlfriend for no appreciable reason, and as it just turns out, the killer is just hanging out, laying in wait, waiting for Matt to come by so he can try and kill Matt too. And it didn't make any sense. The jury took about an hour to come back in terms of deciding that Matthew Terry was guilty. That's pretty fast, especially given the fact that it's a first-degree murder case. My experience is normally juries go back there and they at least want to give it a full, thorough discussion, and that just takes time. However, in this case, we had a lot of really, really great evidence and a lot of really great witnesses. And I think that once the defense had put forward the notion of the phantom killer, which wasn't remotely plausible in any way, I don't think it was hard for the jury to see that the defendant was guilty, especially when they knew that he'd already done it once before in Michigan.
He was found guilty for first-degree premeditated murder. It's a feeling of accomplishment and more along the lines of getting justice for Kay Baker and the justice for her family that they deserve.
Following Terry's conviction for Kay's murder, the judge faces the weighty task of determining his fate, while hearing emotional impact statements from Kay's family and friends.
So victims in the state of Florida have a chance to come forward and give a victim impact statement to tell the judge about how the crime has affected them in terms of whatever loss that they have suffered, whether it's property that's been damaged or a loved one who's been killed, but also to talk about what they think justice merits in this case, whether they want the defendant to go to prison for life, or they want him to get a certain number of years, or they want some sort of mercy shown. It's a chance for the victim to tell the judge what they think is the right outcome, and also a chance to have the defendant hear from the victim's mouth directly how all of this has impacted them.
Additionally, the prosecution urges the court to consider imposing the death penalty on Terry.
To get the death penalty in the state of Florida, the state has to prove at least one of what they call aggravating factors. And in this case, I believe the aggravating factors that the state cited were that Matthew Terry was previously convicted of another violent felony, and that, two, that the murder of Kay Baker was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. They found that the state had proven that Matthew Terry was convicted of a violent felony previously, but on the question of whether the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, they said no. And I remember when they read that part, that was kind of a moment when it kind of became evident that this wasn't going to go in the state's favor. And the next question they had to answer was, are the aggravating factors sufficient to warrant a death sentence? And their answer to that was no, because the state had only proven the one aggravating factor, and they felt like, I guess the jury essentially found that aggravating factor was not sufficient for a death sentence. And so the sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
For the family, I think it's a tremendous relief. They obviously sit in the courtroom listening to this testimony, hearing graphic discussion of how their loved one was murdered and the injuries they suffered, and they're just sitting there. They can't ever be certain. No matter how good a case is, prosecutors can't ever promise that it's always definitely going to be a guilty. And so they're always sitting there just waiting, hoping, dealing with the possibility that this could be a not guilty. It's kind of the same thing for me. It's very different. I feel responsible for trying to make sure that the defendant is held accountable for what he's done. And so once I know that he's going to be held accountable, it's also a very big relief for me as well. A chance to turn and look at the family and tell them that their trust and their patience has been well rewarded, and that the defendant is now really going to have to answer for what he's done.
Thanks to the tireless work of all those involved in advocating for justice for Kay, from detectives to family, a vicious and jealous killer is jailed for life, and the harm he causes to women is finally at an end.
This one will definitely stick with me with how gruesome her injuries were, and then just remembering that night and just the teamwork and hard work and working with Detective Vertu.
I know that jealousy was a big factor. I know that from the Michigan case, as well as what I see here in the Tampa case, in both cases, I think Matthew Terry was, if not jealous, he was insecure, but there was definitely some sort of worry that some other man was going to come and muscle in and take his girl. This was a senseless, needless, brutal crime, and Kay Baker deserved none of this. And it's heartbreaking to think that she's gone and that there are so many people who loved her so dearly who now have to grieve her and remember who she was but don't get to enjoy her in the future.